Alright guys, welcome back to another one. In today's video, we've got some pretty big stuff to talk about in regards to part 3 of the Final Fantasy VII Remake trilogy, as recently director Hamaguchi and producer Kitase have been talking about some exciting stuff to do with this third and final entry. Honestly, it's pretty insane that we've got the amount of information we currently have for part 3, considering that Rebirth only released at the beginning of this year. It hasn't even been an entire year yet. Not only do I want to talk about all of the recent news stuff, but also combine in all of the other things that have been mentioned throughout this year in relation to part 3. Perhaps the biggest piece of information that was recently shared by Hamaguchi was that the plot of the third game has been completed and that the team has started full-blown production on the game. It was actually mentioned at the beginning of this year that around the time of Rebirth's release, the plot of part 3 had already entered into its tentative phase. So I wouldn't take this recent confirmation from Hamaguchi as the plot has been finalized as of November. The game's narrative has likely been completed for a little while now, and development likely started a few months back. The Final Fantasy VII Remake trilogy is being developed by Square Enix's Business Division 1. And I think it's safe to say that out of all of the business divisions within Square Enix, this team right here has got to be the most productive. I still can't believe that we have Rebirth only 4 years after the release of Remake. It was actually mentioned by Kitase in the Rebirth Ultimania that Rebirth's development only took about 3 years, due to the first year after Remake's release was spent working on the Intermission DLC. It was also mentioned that Kitase hopes that Part 3 can stick to a similar schedule, so a development time of anywhere to 3 to 4 years. This means that at the earliest we can expect Part 3 sometime in 2027. Obviously, this trilogy of games is one of the biggest and highest priorities at Square Enix, and hence why a lot of resources are dedicated to Business Division 1 for development. This is why we're seeing these games being released at such a consistent pace. It also appears that this team, much like From Software, are a masterclass of repurposing already developed assets and simply just touching them up. However though, if Part 3 does release in 2027, that means that over the span of 7 years, which funny, Square Enix have managed to release 3 50-hour plus AAA RPGs, which is honestly incredibly impressive. It is something that is really just unprecedented in today's current gaming industry. Throughout this year, it has been mentioned by both Kitase and Hamaguchi that the high expectations set for the third and final chapter of the Remake trilogy are expectations that the development team plan on meeting. They are seeking to make the world of Final Fantasy VII even bigger than it currently is now. And this is no doubt in reference to both the physical scale of the world itself, as well as the story and lore surrounding it. But Hamaguchi has made the massive claim that he's absolutely confident that the third game in the Final Fantasy VII Remake series will be one of the most loved, most popular games in the whole history of video games once again. An incredibly bold claim, to be sure. However, when I look at the absolute quality of Rebirth, being that I genuinely do feel as if it's one of the greatest video games that Square Enix has ever released, and I don't say that lightly, I genuinely do believe that from everything the team has learned through Remake and Rebirth's development, taking in player feedback from what people do and don't want to see, I absolutely do believe that this team will deliver something well beyond what we saw within Rebirth, and even then, that's saying something. Circling back to the plot, it has been mentioned that the team are keeping the original story in mind, and this should be pretty obvious from what we experienced within Rebirth. Kitase mentioned, I don't think it's going to be a storyline that will betray fans of the original, but also at the same time, it's been 27 years since the original Final Fantasy VII. There are these things that we feel we can only do now in the Remake project that can bring a new happiness, a new sort of feeling of satisfaction to the players playing the game now 27 years later. What will entail exactly is something we hope players will experience soon. This conversation has a lot of people divided because hardcore dedicated fans do want a complete one-to-one remake of the story that we saw within the original PlayStation 1 game. However, some people are hoping that we see something entirely new. Some people were pretty vocal about their disappointment in seeing that Aerith had the same fate in Rebirth that she does in the original. And while there are most definitely a lot of new additions to the narrative, it seems as if at least at the moment anyway, that it's more of an expansion upon that pre-established story than going in a completely new direction. We know that there are multiple parallel worlds out there, about 6 to be exact, along with everything that's going on with the Whispers. Even though Aerith died once again, she's still able to communicate with Cloud, telling us that she will play a role in Part 3. And of course, the new stuff that we've received with Zack. There's most certainly a lot of new, but the conclusions that we've been seeing so far have still been true to the original. Part 3 will finally answer the question though, is this story that's being presented within the Remake trilogy truly on the same original tracks, or are we really staring in a direction that is entirely different? Do know though that the team certainly do want to stay within the sights of the original, and that with the comment here that Kitase has made that fans of the original won't be betrayed, it would seem that they're trying to strike this balance of catering to fans of that original story while also providing something entirely new for people that are looking for it. Earlier this year, Hamaguchi made a comment about the Airship System. In the final portions of Final Fantasy VII, which Part 3 will revolve around, of course we use the Highwind in order to get around the world, to reach areas like the Icicle area and the Northern Crater. This of course is returning and is going to be one of the core systems as to how we travel and navigate the world in Part 3. Mentioning, as well as traveling around the world in the Highwind, you will absolutely be able to do that. There's another aspect of the gameplay you'll be able to access from the Highwind, do something new and special while you're riding around on it. Recently, Hamaguchi expanded on the Highwind system, mentioning, in Final Fantasy VII Rebirth we provided a vast map, but in terms of the original game, the third installment will feature the Highwind, so we need to allow players to experience the world from an even higher perspective. The airship will not be handled as a system trick. Instead, we will take it head on, allowing players to freely fly around the map. So this means that it will work like any of the other fully drivable vehicles in Rebirth, whether that be the Bronco on water or the buggy within the Corral region. Because most of us are assuming that we'll be able to explore literally every single region of Gaia, both new in Part 3 like Wutai and the Icicle area, along with any of the previous areas that we've visited within Rebirth and Remake, as we also know at some stage we have to return to Midgar. A lot of us are expecting the sheer scale of Part 3 to just be monumentally massive. Even looking at Rebirth, it is a pretty large open world game, but no doubt we can expect Part 3 to be on an even bigger scale, so prepare yourself for likely what is going to be a close on 200 gig game size. Hamaguchi has recently made a comment on perhaps one of the biggest complaints about Rebirth, the overwhelming volume of minigames. He mentions for Part 3 that one thing perhaps that maybe needs looking at is that there was a certain number of people who said there were too many minigames in Rebirth, and ultimately I can see their point of view. Obviously, the more different types of content, the more minigames you put into a title, the more likely it is that people will like some and not others. So I don't think we've failed at all in that decision of having such a broad amount of content there. It was what was needed for the game, but certainly looking forward to the third game and to other games, if you asked me would I do the same number of minigames, I don't think I would. We'll work out how maybe we can cut it down to a bit more of a manageable size for the group of players who quite rightly said that maybe there was too much there for them. So this is one of the big complaints that comes up about Rebirth quite often. I remember especially around release, a lot of people were saying that they've quite literally never seen so many mini-games packed into one game, a game that isn't meant to be a multiplayer party game revolving around mini-games. It is true, this game has so many mini-games. I didn't really have too much of an issue with this. There are some here that I was a little bit tired of by the point of achieving the platinum for Rebirth, but still, I enjoyed almost all of them. However, if I'm looking at it, would I prefer more world and combat focused content over mini-game content? Yes, absolutely. So it seems as if they are taking this piece of feedback quite seriously, and that for Part 3 it will likely have less mini-game content than Rebirth. I hope though that they don't completely start shifting focus away from the mini-games, because a lot of them, and especially looking at something like the Chocobo racing, was done so well. Queen's Queen's Blood also needs to stay as well. I had so much fun with this. I generally don't like card games at all, but I don't know, something about Queen's Blood just hit different. I'd love to see a little bit of an evolution of it in Part 3. Hell, I'd like to see this even turn into its own thing, but yeah, this has to stay. Another really interesting comment from Hamaguchi was the comment towards complaints on Rebirth's Platinum Trophy. He said, "I think there is one other thing actually, which I can say was a mistake on my part, something that I've already apologized for, and I definitely will not do again, which is how difficult I made it to get the Platinum Trophy. So rest assured, I've learned from that, and in the future, I will not be making Platinum Trophies that difficult." Now, I absolutely have to disagree with the complaints towards Rebirth's Platinum Trophy. It is difficult, absolutely, and quite a few levels beyond the difficulty of remakes. But for a game with this amount of scale to it, you would only assume that, yeah, it's obviously going to include quite a challenging Platinum. I think more so than not, Platinum Trophies should absolutely be challenging to achieve. Because man, after finishing up the last few simulator challenges, oh my god, the dopamine hit. It was glorious. And the expectation here is that Part 3 will include challenges beyond what we got within Rebirth. I mean, after all, we are going to be fighting the weapon. So personally, I'm not too keen on the idea to make Part 3's Platinum Trophy easier to achieve than Rebirth. I just don't really think that makes too much sense. There was also a comment made on Rebirth DLC. A lot of people are wanting to see additional content for the game, considering that Remake saw the intermission Youthy DLC. However, Hamaguchi has explained that while he knows that there is fan demand for a Rebirth DLC, they rather want to spend their time focusing on getting Part 3 out as fast as possible. We've decided not to focus the development resources on creating additional extra episodes for DLC at the moment. We really are putting all of our efforts into getting the third game out as quickly as we can. And I feel like this is the right move personally. The intermission DLC was worked on for a year, and if we were to receive a Rebirth DLC, that's gonna yet again cut out another year's worth of dev time towards Part 3. At this point, I think most people are in agreement that we just want our filthy goblin fingers on the third and final slice of the Remake trilogy. And finally, Hamaguchi has made a comment on what will happen after Part 3's release in terms of what project is next. Starting with this slice from the Games Radar interview, he mentioned, "When we get to the end of the trilogy in terms of what the next project that the team works on, I really don't know yet at all. It could be the next numbered Final Fantasy. It could be a completely different brand. We might start up a completely new brand, but whatever it is, I'm incredibly excited to work on that and see what we can do with that knowledge we've built up." Getting this team and Hamaguchi as director on the next numbered Final Fantasy is absolutely something I could see. We know that Square Enix like to have different teams, different writers and directors working on the different numbered Final Fantasy games to have fresh, new approaches to each one. We know that Hamaguchi is more than capable as a director, and looking at Business Division 1, man, what a team. I would love to see them back on a numbered Final Fantasy game. These guys did work on Final Fantasy 13, by the way. There has been new talent that's joined the team since then, and considering the expertise that they've picked up through developing the Remake trilogy, yeah, I mean, these guys could absolutely deliver one of the best numbered Final Fantasy games the series has ever seen. It would be interesting to see what they would do with that though. Would they apply the systems that were developed for Remake, looking at the combat system of being an action RPG, but with more tactical, almost turn-based elements intertwined into it? There is absolutely high demand for Final Fantasy to return back to its turn-based roots, and I think this team would do a pretty good job of that. However, it was also mentioned that there is possibility to expand further upon Final Fantasy VII's world, mentioning that after Part 3, they might move on to look at some other stories and dig a bit deeper. There's definitely a call out there to see other spotlights on other parts of the world and the universe, different characters, so I'd like to maybe switch to looking at them in a different way after we've got the third game out. A lot of people want to see a remake of either Dirge of Cerberus or Before Crisis, and hell, even a video game take on Advent Children. There's still a lot of material, even though parts of these have been touched upon so far within both Remake and Rebirth, but to have a full experience of in a remade video game format, people would absolutely love to see. I know for me personally, I would love to see something new done with Dirge of Cerberus. So these are still early days as to exactly what Business Division 1 will be doing after Part 3, but there are a lot lots of avenues they can take. Ultimately, it'll come down to what the higher-ups at Square Enix want to do with the resources of this team. If they see that there is still a lot of potential remaining for Final Fantasy VII after Part 3's release, then I can imagine that they'll want to steer the team more in the direction of further expanding upon FF7 rather than going towards something new or a numbered Final Fantasy. Then again, Hamaguchi and Business Division 1 could be what brings the numbered Final Fantasy games back to their glory days. So that's everything you guys need to know about Part 3 for the time being. Definitely some exciting stuff brewing, and honestly speaking, just with the rate in which Business Division 1 work, it shouldn't be too long before we actually hear about Part 3. I've heard rumblings that we may get something like a teaser looking at as early as next year. However guys, thank you so much for tuning in. As always, be sure to leave your thoughts and opinions in the comment section down below. Subscribe to the channel to keep up with everything going on here. A big thank you to my wonderful patrons. I hope you're all having a fantastic day, and we'll talk real soon.